Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, South Africa is slammed by the International Criminal Court for failing to act on an arrest warrant for Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir. He's wanted for war crimes, but the World Court does hold back from referring Pretoria's lapse to the United Nations. While the ICC's restraint may well have been influenced by South Africa's threat to leave its jurisdiction, the African Union has in the past called for member states to quit the ICC over alleged anti-African bias. And in Cameroon, winning over the in-laws can break the bank and your spirit. As well as huge dowries, would-be grooms have to face some unusual challenges before sealing the deal. We take a closer look. But first, the International Criminal Court has criticised South Africa for not arresting Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir on a genocide warrant whilst he was in Johannesburg back in 2015. However, the court did stop short of referring Pretoria to the UN over the lapse. Now, judges disagreed with South Africa's argument that Bashir couldn't be detained because he had diplomatic immunity. But the decision not to take Pretoria's non-compliance further could have been affected by its past threats to pull out from the World Court. Well, to take a closer look, we're joined by Ashlyn Lang. She's in Johannesburg. Ashlyn, is the International Criminal Court trying to play nice with South Africa by holding back from taking it to the United Nations?
Well, I mean, the ICC's supporters would say that its ruling today, which is quite unusual, delivers really an important warning to other countries who might be considering ignoring the arrest warrants issued to individuals around the world and its obligations to the International Court. However, it is worth noting the ICC doesn't really have any powers. These kind of rulings are purely symbolic. It could have referred to the UN Security Council, but it remains unclear what concrete action might have in fact flowed from that. South Africa is a trendsetter in the region. It is a power broker, and I'm sure at the forefront of the judges' minds were the possibility that, it could have sparked a more wholesale revolt in the continent. It was an extraordinary situation. South Africa did foresee the risk of Bashir attending an African Union summit in Johannesburg. It approached the court to ask for leniency, for special allowances to be made. That permission was refused by the ICC, and Bashir was invited anyway. When he arrived in South Africa, a domestic court ruled that he should be detained, but instead of following that instruction, lawyers representing the South African government stalled for time in court, while at the same time the government appeared to turn a blind eye to Bashir, al-Bashir then leaving the country. So really an extraordinary situation, and it remains to be seen what the reaction here will be, not so much so far tonight.
Ashlyn, so what are South Africa's choices now? Has it been let off the hook or just given more breathing room?
To be honest, I suspect this will only strengthen the arguments within government that we've heard aired for South Africa to leave the court. This week, most of the ANC's members met for a policy conference, and at that conference, apparently, even though very secretive, those deliberations, it was confirmed that they supported the government's plans to pull out of the ICC altogether. Certainly that is an argument that has won widespread backing on the continent. The African Union has also looked at bringing a kind of broad proposal for all members to withdraw en masse from the ICC. African countries, including Zimbabwe, Uganda, Kenya and Burundi and South Africa, argue that the court has focused too much on African affairs and African leaders in the past who might mistreat their citizens. The ICC supporters, of course, will say that Africans, in fact themselves, African governments refer to the court, and therefore they really can't complain when the court looks at them.
Well, thanks very much. Ashlyn Lang there for us in Johannesburg. Well, South Africa was harshly criticised by rights activists for dropping the ball in detaining al-Bashir. He was indicted back in 2008 for the persecution of ethnic groups in Darfur, but has continued to travel internationally. His liberty is a reflection of the tense relationship the International Criminal Court has with some of its members.
It's been nearly a decade since international arrest warrants were issued for Omar al-Bashir. But the world's highest court is no closer to bringing the Sudanese president to justice. Bashir has led the trouble-hit northeast African country since 1989, when he swept to power in a military coup. Now he faces charges, which he denies, of genocide and crimes against humanity over the deaths and persecution of ethnic groups in the western province of Darfur. The UN says at least 300,000 people have been killed and 2.5 million displaced since ethnic minorities took up arms against Bashir's Arab-dominated government in 2003. Despite widespread international condemnation and arrest warrants, a number of countries aren't cooperating, even those who signed up to the 1998 Rome Statute, the ICC's founding document. South Africa is one. In 2015, President Bashir attended an African Union summit in Johannesburg and then was allowed to leave the country unhindered. The Bashir case highlights a growing crisis of legitimacy surrounding the ICC. It's been accused of focusing too heavily on African leaders and ignoring more politically powerful leaders elsewhere. 9 out of 10 situations currently under investigation by the court focus on countries in Africa. A number of African heads of state have threatened to withdraw from the court. If they do this, they'll join India, China, Russia and the United States, none of which have ratified the ICC's founding document.
In other news, 7 children and 1 adult were killed in a stampede at Malawi's National Stadium on Thursday. It happened as crowds gathered at the 40,000-seat site to celebrate Independence Day. The crush happened as the gates were opened at Bingu Stadium in Lilongwe, where a presidential address and football match had been planned. Zambia's president has declared a state of emergency after blaming a fire at the country's biggest market on his political opponent. Edgar Lungu's called Tuesday's blaze politically motivated arson. The opposition UPNDs branded the use of emergency powers a ploy to make it easier for police to arrest its supporters. Now, political tensions have been on the rise in Zambia since the UPND's leader, Hakainde Hichilema, was arrested in April and charged with treason. Some Zambians are concerned about Lungu's motivation for calling a state of emergency.
So now, if my rights are taken away from me, for instance, how am I going to live? How can I live as a human being? No freedom of movement, no freedom of speech, no freedom of expression.
The state of emergency is to control the crime which is happening.
For me as a student, I think it's going to be inconveniencing. If I'm going to have time limits as to when I'm supposed to go to school, I think it's going to be inconveniencing because I would have some time that I've set for myself maybe to study. So if I'm having those limits, it's going to inconvenience my work at school.
Well, finally, in Cameroon, winning over the in-laws can break the bank and your spirit. As well as huge dowries, would-be grooms have to face some pretty unusual challenges before sealing the deal. Our correspondents report.
This stock of food and beverages are being taken to a dowry ceremony. It took the future groom, a 30-year-old forestry worker, nearly 3 years to get the funds together to be able to offer this oversized food hamper to his prospective in-laws.
It took me about 3 years to be able to get all of this. And it cost me around 2.5 million.
2.5 million CFA francs, nearly 4,000 euros, in a country where the minimum wage is 36,000 francs or 54 euros. A few kilometres away at the in-laws' family compound. The future groom and the dowry he's brought with him get a very warm welcome. At nightfall, the dowry ceremony begins. And it's the moment of truth for the fiancé after everything he's endured.
The law in Cameroon tells us that we mustn't pay a dowry for a woman over 1.5 million, but it doesn't matter. When you are proud of what you have, even if it costs 4 or 5 million, you can still pay it.
Joseph's first test, to identify his fiancée hiding under a sheet with other women. At the 3 failed attempts to pick out his wife-to-be, he pays a fine until finally, relief. He's found her, to her great delight.
It's proof of his love. He loves me and I love him too. He isn't just anyone.
After a final check that all the gifts have been received, the head of the bride's family can finally relax.
The dowries for the village, it's symbolic among us Betties. It means the family and everyone knows the bride doesn't belong to us anymore. She now belongs to another family.
The happily wedded groom spent more than 4 million CFA francs, around 6,000 euros, to finally be able to live as man and wife with his girlfriend of 10 years.
Well, low-key events are overrated, I reckon. Well, that's it, though, for Eye on Africa. Thanks very much for joining us. Do so again. Take care.